Chisel is a tool that no woodworker should be without, and it is used in everything from rough carpentry through to fine joinery. It's a very versatile tool and everyone will need a set at one stage or another. So in this video, we're going to try and demystify the chisel and go over all the ins and outs of the Narix range specifically, but the information we go over is applicable to basically all the manufacturers out there. What I'm going to do in this video is we're going to break it down into three main categories and go over those in their individual groups. The first category is the everyday woodworker, and this is the chisels that everyone knows, everyone's seen, and anyone will find useful on one project or another, and that is going to be the cabinet or the bench chisels. Cabinet chisels can also be referred to as bevel edge chisels, and bench chisels are often referred to as firmer chisels, although that's not technically correct. Now the second category is going to be called the hand cut flexes, and that's the people that are really using the chisels for joinery, so cutting mortises, flushing up tenons, things like that. So these are going to include the mortising chisels, the crank neck chisels, as well as the butt chisels. And butt chisels could be classified either one, but we're chucking it in there. Now the last category is going to be the specialty chisels or the fancy pants chisels, and these are chisels that you don't really need for most things, but they are certainly going to be useful for very specific applications, or will just do the job of what another chisel can do, but just a little bit better. And these are going to include the corner clearing chisels, skew chisels, and we're also going to look at the paring chisels in this category as well. Now there are a load of other specialized chisels out there that we're not even touching base on in this video, but if you want to see more on those obscure and kind of out there chisels, leave a comment below and maybe we'll get around to doing one in the future. So now that we know the categories and what fits into them, let's actually go over the different styles of chisels, some use cases, and get to know what makes them what they are. So the first one we're going to look at is the bench chisel. And as the name suggests, these chisels are typically the ones that sit on your bench and use for day-to-day tasks. They typically have a slightly thicker blade than others. It also has a really strong handle. So you'll notice on the Narix ones here, we have a ferrule at the top and the bottom, and that means that we can beat on this with a mallet and we don't run much risk of damaging the handle. So you can use this with a mallet, so things like chopping small mortises, squaring up cheeks, things like that. Now they're typically going to be sharpened with 25-degree bevel angles. You could go a little bit steeper on these to get a little bit more bulk between that bevel, but 24, 25 degrees, that tends to really work well for these chisels, and that's how they come from the factory. Now the second chisel we have is the cabinet chisel or the bevel edge chisel, and right away you can see quite a few obvious changes. The most obvious thing is going to be the handle. The handle you can see is a different style altogether, only got a ferrule at the bottom, and it has a nice rounded top, so it makes it easy to kind of palm and get in and do hand operations with paring. It's really not suitable for hitting with a mallet, it's really wanting to be used for hand operations only. The second difference is going to be the bevel edge. So as we can compare our bench chisel to our cabinet chisel, you can see that while they both have got bevels along the edges, they are quite a different style. Cabinet chisel comes much further down the edge of the chisel, creating quite a steep and pronounced bevel, and that makes them a lot easier to get into tighter places. So say you're cutting large dovetails, something like that, this bevel edge is going to make it easier to get into those tight to reach places. Now just like the bench chisels, these come sharpened at around 24 degrees, maybe 25, and that's a pretty good angle for these. Typically you would want to stick with the shallower angles for a cabinet chisel because it gets you a much finer edge. So these, in my opinion, are the chisels that you should really keep sharp and only use for lighter duty applications. So that's things like paring and cleanup. And you know, as the name suggests, a cabinet chisel, it's kept in the cabinet and just pulled out when you need it. With those everyday style chisels out of the way, let's move on to the second category, which is our hand cut flexes. The first one we're going to look at is the butt chisel, and while this isn't strictly only suitable for the hand cut woodworkers out there, the reason I include it in this category and not the everyday woodworker is because these are essentially the exact same chisel as our cabinet chisels, just scaled down. So you'll feature a much shorter blade and a much shorter handle. And these are really useful for smaller joinery applications. It's easy to get palmed in your hand, so you get a lot of control. And say you're doing a small hinge mortise, something like that, you're just going to get a lot more control. The shorter blade and the shorter handle just puts you much closer to the kind of cutting edge. So while it's not strictly a joinery chisel, it's used a lot in places where you are fine-tuning joints, and that's why I've put it in this category. Now, the second chisel we're going to look at is our mortising chisels, and these things are beefy. You can see right away that the blades are super thick. There is absolutely no bevel other than the cutting edge, and these are just used for one application and one application only, and that is chopping out mortises. So you can see that the handle design is very similar to that of the bench chisels, but these have a really long tang and a ferrule on the end of their handle. So you can beat these with a mallet, you can put a lot of force, and furthermore, you can put a lot of leverage onto that blade, so as you're chopping your mortise, you're able to break out the material that you're clearing and clear that mortise really quick. The dead-on 90-degree edges makes it really easy to keep that as a nice reference surface, so if you're chopping your mortise, it's very easy to stay true. And of course, the overall length gives you a heap of leverage. Now, the last chisel that I'm going to look at in this category is the cranked neck chisel. And while I think these should be in everyone's toolbox because they are really useful, the reason I've put them in the hand cut flexor is because often these are used for clearing trenches and things like that, which most power tool woodworkers would use a router to do. So obviously the most obvious fact you can see about this is that we have a cranked handle which is out of the way. So the chisel can sit flat on the surface with the handle not interfering. So what these are really good for are going to be clearing out trenches that you've cut into a board that just needs some cleanup. But the other thing these are really useful for are getting into hard to reach places to clean up glue squeeze out, because you can hit this right up against the edge of a cabinet and you can get into those hard to reach places where if you were using a standard cabinet chisel, the blade would interfere, so you can't really get in as easily. So by having that cranked neck, it just gives you a little bit more reach and a bit more versatility. Lastly, we'll look at those specialized ones or the fancy pants options. So let's get into those. Firstly, the skews. So skews are left or right-handed depending on how they are ground, and they are sold as a pair because of that fact. The blades themselves are just the same as the bench chisels, with the real difference just being that we have an angled bevel ground into it. That skewed angle just gives us a really pointy edge that can reach into really hard to reach places. So you'll find these would be useful on things like finger joints, dovetails, also for weird shape cleanup and things like that. The next chisel is going to be the corner clearing chisel, and these, in my opinion, are a true luxury item which you really don't need, as you can achieve the same result using any other chisel. But I guess in certain applications they are useful. For what these are a 90-degree edge chisel with two separate cutting faces. So when you're chopping a mortise, whether it be a hinge plate or a traditional mortise, you can come in to the rounded corner or the less than ideal corner, beat down on this, and you're left with a perfectly 90-degree edge. Now, don't get me wrong, these are definitely going to be useful and I can see the point of them, but the reason I say they're a luxury item that you don't really need is because all you're doing is creating a 90-degree edge, and you can do that with a single chisel and some good layout using a square and a marking knife. Now, the last ones are our paring chisels, and Aric's paring chisels are a take on an old school framing chisel, but it's definitely not got the same level of strength or the same size, as often framing chisels are a lot wider, a lot thicker, and even longer. Despite the size, this is still quite a gentle tool, so you'll be using this with a handheld operation. You wouldn't really be hitting it with a mallet. What this would typically be used for is on a large tenon or on a deep cheek for just paring away material with a long flat reference surface area. So you're easily going to be able to get this referencing flat on a surface and just take off the high spots. So now that we have an understanding of the different styles of chisels and what their use cases are and how and where they'd be applied, let's just quickly touch on the subject of money and whether the cost is indicative of quality and is it worth spending the extra cash, especially when we're first setting up. The simple answer of this for Narex in particular is you're getting guaranteed quality, and it doesn't really matter what price bracket that tool falls into. Narex has been around since 1919, so over 100 years, and put simply, if they were making junk, there is no way they would make it to 100 years without people kind of falling off the bandwagon. So that's the simple answer. But if you want to get a bit more complicated, it really comes down to the processes they use in manufacturing and the post processes they use once it's built. So things like heat treat. Metallurgy, or however it's pronounced, a word I've never been able to say, could be a whole video, if not whole series in and of itself. It is a really deep thing that engineers and metallurgists dedicate their life to. But the basics that you just need to know is that not all steel is created equally, and there is just hundreds of variants with all very unique properties. So with Narex, they use a high quality tool steel. Depending on the range, it's going to be either chromium, I got to look at this, chromium magnesium or chromium vanadium. Now, I don't really know what the difference between those two are, but I can tell you the properties of them are both very hard, very stiff, but they're not fragile. Now, it's not only just the steel that's important, but it's also the processes used to create the tool and the post processes used to finish the tool. Now, all the Narex tools are heat treated, and that just means that they are heating up the steel to a specific temperature to get all the molecules to align in a specific way to get the desired properties. So you can make certain steels really hard by heat treating it and quenching it, and you can make the same steel really soft by annealing it, which is a slow, controlled process of heat treating. This process will affect things like hardness, rigidity, and also shock resistance. So that's really important with a tool that you might be hitting with a mallet. Now, this heat treating process can affect things which are quite obvious. So if you have a heat treated tool which is done professionally and properly, it's going to hold its cutting edge a lot longer, which means you don't have to sharpen it as often. But it also has the strange effect that you might not consider, and it will have an impact on how easy it is to sharpen. So on a tool that is heat treated and heat treated properly, it's going to be a lot easier to sharpen than a tool that has not been heat treated at all or incorrectly, because after all, if it's too soft, you're going to have a hard time getting a razor sharp edge on it, because that edge is just going to fold over. On the other extreme, if it's too hard, that edge is going to become too fragile, so as it thins out, it's just going to fracture off and you're never going to be able to get a razor sharp edge. So there is a balance between being too soft and too hard. So with cheaper tools, this is a process that is often missed or just rushed, which will produce the inconsistent quality when it comes to the tool. So even as you sharpen the tool, it could change throughout the life of the tool, which is crazy, but I've seen it happen. Basically what I'm saying is, if you've been sharpening a cheap chisel and you just can't get that razor sharp edge, it's probably not you. It's probably the tool, maybe. I mean, it's probably a bit of both, if I'm being fair. But yeah, don't be too hard on yourself. If you're working with cheap tools and you can't get a razor sharp edge, that could be the reason. Anyway, this has been a really long video with a lot of information, but I did my best to keep it short and concise and relevant to what we have. So hopefully you've enjoyed it and got something out of it. So if you're interested in any of these products that we've shown today, links will be in the description as always. And if you've enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up, maybe leave a comment below, because that way I get to do more of these videos, which is really fun. And yeah, let the powers that be know that we need more videos. Anyway, that's going to be it for now. So remember, think wooden thoughts, and I'll see you next time.